So biogeography is the study of how organisms differ over geographical gradients, so like over a range of altitudes or a range of latitudes, and trying to understand how they differ and why they differ. Well, over a geographical gradient, you have a range of different environments. So if you're thinking in terms of latitude, you go from tropical environments down to temperate environments. And so if you're seeing a change in the organisms that live in those particular environments, that's because they've adapted. For example, some have adapted to hot environments, some have adapted to cold environments. But all of that has been the result of evolutionary processes that have been driven by the environment and by geography. So the reason why I really enjoy researching evolution is because it answers all the big why questions in biology. Why are things the way they are? There was a very famous statement that said nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And because I study diversity across species and try and understand why and how they're adapted to their environment, there's kind of no end of questions you can ask and no end of things you can find out about everything from plants through to insects through to humans when you study evolution. So a lot of the work that I do involves analysing data on the characteristics, the behaviours, the morphologies, in other words, like the anatomy and the physiology of organisms, plants and animals, and relating that to their evolutionary relationships to try and understand why closely related species share similarities and sometimes why closely related species differ and what caused them to differ, what drove them apart in their evolutionary past. So there's a never-ending realm of stuff you can investigate, and I often do this using data that's been collected by others, but trying to look for patterns in it. So the kind of data I use are data that's based on measuring things. So, for example, you could go to museum collections and measure, for example, the length of the bills of birds or their wing lengths or leg lengths, and you can trace how that changes over recent historical time. But of course you can extend that even further and go back and look at fossil specimens and examine how organisms have changed over much longer periods of geological time. And then you might be interested in relating that to their evolutionary relationships, and a good way of trying to estimate their evolutionary relationships is to look at their DNA and see how much their DNA differs. Generally, species that are fairly closely related have more similar DNA, and species that are more distantly related have more dissimilar DNA. So if you know something about the rate at which DNA evolves, you can also say something about how long ago it is since two species separated from each other. So invasive species are simultaneously interesting and obviously a problem. In a lot of cases they're a problem because invasive species move in to a newer environment and often outcompete and replace native species, and that's a major threat for conservation of endangered species worldwide. On the other hand, from an evolutionary biology point of view, invasive species are really interesting because they are like evolutionary experiments in action. You have a new species moving into a new environment and then adapting rapidly to that environment. And so, for example, seeing how cane toads have invaded into Australia, and you can see in the 80 or 90 years since they've been in Australia how they have changed. For example, the cane toads that are now spreading into Western Australia don't hop anymore. They have longer legs and they run. So you're getting these changes in these kind of invasive species which make fascinating studies for evolution. The challenge, though, with invasive species is the whole history of Earth is essentially part one of invasive species. So it's sometimes difficult to know where a species originally came from. If it's spread here, there, and everywhere, trying to reconstruct, well, where did this originate and why did it originate? What were the evolutionary forces that caused this species initially to evolve? That can become very complicated when you've got multiple populations of this spread across the planet. And so what you try and do there is look at their DNA, look at how they're related to other species. They may be closely related to a set of species that are only found in South Africa, for example. So maybe that indicates that originally that invasive species that's now found all over the world was originally from southern Africa. So if we understand how species vary across different environments, we can start to make predictions about what will happen when that environment changes. And of course, that's a big issue these days when we think about climate change. So if we start to see how species adapt to a warmer environment, we can start to make predictions. Well, if the environment is warming more generally, how are species going to respond? How are they going to change the way they develop? How are they going to change in their behaviours and their body shapes? How are they going to change in terms of the distribution of those species? Are they going to move to different areas to be able to cope with the change in temperature? So that's a key way in which biogeography is helping us understand and predict responses to climate change. So one example of this is work that people in my group have done looking at the bills of birds and looking at how they have been increasing over time. We've got evidence from museum records, for example, that Australian parrots are getting bigger beaks, and this ties in nicely. They thermoregulate through their beaks. In other words, they help control their body temperature through their beaks. If it's warmer, it helps to have a bigger beak, and that's what we're seeing, that as the climate's been warming, the beaks of these parrots is getting bigger.